The paper was already ruined when I picked it up, and I stood there in that borrowed room with rain hammering the window like it had somewhere urgent to be, staring at the smudge across my own handwriting, at the corner she had folded without meaning to when she shoved her garment bag onto the bed closest to the outlet. My chest did something I did not have a name for yet. She looked up from her suitcase, saw my face, and laughed. Not unkindly, the kind of laugh that comes out before a person can stop it. "That is just paper, isn't it?" she said, tilting her head. "Why are you looking at it like I broke your arm?" I did not answer right away. I folded the sketch along its new crease instead of the old one, smoothed it flat against my knee, and set it on the desk like it still mattered, because it did, though not for the reason she thought. Outside, the storm that had grounded every flight out of the mountains for the next 2 days was just getting started. And somewhere in my chest, so was something else. I did not know yet that the woman across that room, the one I had spent 2 years calling my rival without ever once saying her name out loud in a kind voice, was about to become the only person who ever fixed my mistakes without making me feel small for making them. Let me back up. My name is Daniel Corwin, and I have spent almost 14 years doing structural engineering for buildings that other people get to stand in front of and take photographs, while I stay in the back office running load calculations nobody thanks you for until the day they matter. I like the quiet of it. I like that a beam either holds or it does not, that a column either carries its weight or it fails, and there is no argument to be had about whose feelings got hurt in the process. Numbers do not lie to you, and they do not leave. That mattered more to me after my marriage ended than I would have admitted to anyone at the time. My ex-wife, Renee, did not leave because of some big betrayal. There was no other man, no secret account, nothing you could point to and say, "There, that is the crack that brought the whole thing down." We just stopped fitting the load we were supposed to carry together. I used to bring my calculations home in my head, sit at dinner running numbers on tension and shear while she talked about her day, and somewhere in there she stopped trying to reach me, and I let her stop, because it was easier than admitting I did not know how to be present for anything that could not be measured. By the time we sat across from a mediator instead of each other, we were both just tired, and I told myself I had learned my lesson. Never again would I let work bleed into the part of my life that was supposed to be soft. I built that rule the way I built everything else, with a foundation I trusted more than I trusted myself. The pencil started it all, if you want to trace it back that far. My father gave me a mechanical drafting pencil the week I graduated with my engineering degree, a heavy old thing with a brass band around the barrel that had gone green with age by the time it reached me. He had used it for 30 years doing surveying work before his hands gave out on him, and he told me, "Hold on to this, because a man who draws his own lines by hand still knows what he is building before the computer tells him." I have used that pencil for every rough sketch of every project I have ever touched. Before anything goes into the software, it goes onto paper first, in my own hand, with lead worn down by my own grip. My coworkers used to tease me about it, the guy with the antique pencil in an office full of tablets, but I never let it go, because it was the one thing in my life that connected the man I used to be, before the divorce, before the loneliness settled into something almost comfortable, to the man I was trying to become. I met Mara Bishop the same week the merger papers went through, though met is a generous word for what actually happened. 2 years ago, my firm, a small structural outfit called Corwin and Vance, got folded into a much larger regional company after Vance decided he was done fighting for contracts and wanted out. The larger company already had an architecture division under a woman named Mara Bishop, and before the merger, our two firms had gone head-to-head on a mixed-use development downtown, the kind of project that could make or break a small firm's year. We lost that bid. Not because our numbers were wrong, but because her design solved a site constraint problem in a way that made our structural approach look clumsy by comparison, and the client noticed. I did not take it well. I remember standing in a parking garage after the announcement, calling Vance and telling him the architect on the winning team had made us look like amateurs, and somewhere in that conversation, I decided Mara Bishop was the reason my year had gone sideways. It did not occur to me, not for a long time, that she had simply done her job better than I had done mine that particular week, and that there was nothing personal in it at all. So, when the merger happened and I found myself sharing a building with her, I built my first rule without even noticing I was doing it. I would be professional, cordial in meetings, and otherwise as invisible to her as I could manage. I did not need to like the architect who had cost me a contract. I did not need to know anything about her beyond her name on an email chain. That rule held for almost a year, through joint project meetings where we sat across long tables from each other and spoke only when the agenda required it, through hallway encounters where a nod was the full extent of our relationship. I told myself this was fine. I told myself I preferred it this way. What I did not expect was the first project that actually required us to work side by side, a renovation of an old textile warehouse into mixed-income housing, the kind of job where the architecture and the structure have to breathe together or the whole thing falls apart on paper before it ever gets built. Mara had done the design. I had the structural review, and the first time she walked into my office to talk through a load-bearing wall she wanted removed to open up a common room, I braced myself for a fight. She did not fight. She listened. She asked good questions, the kind that told me she had actually read my calculations instead of skimming them for talking points, and when I explained why that particular wall could not come out without a steel frame to redistribute the load, she nodded slowly and said, "Then, let's find where the frame goes, instead of pretending the wall isn't the problem." It was such a small thing, agreeing with an engineer instead of arguing with one, but it cracked something open in me that I had sealed shut 2 years earlier. That was the moment I started noticing her, not as the woman who had beaten me on a bid, but as someone who actually respected the invisible math holding up the visible things she was so proud of designing. What nobody tells you about resentment is how much work it takes to keep it alive. I had been carrying mine around like a weight I refused to set down, and somewhere in that warehouse project, my arms just got tired. We started grabbing coffee before site visits, not because either of us suggested it exactly, but because we both showed up early and it felt strange to stand in silence when we could be talking instead. She told me about her own divorce, 3 years before mine. A marriage that ended not with a fight, but with a slow realization that they had built a life around 2 people who no longer existed. I recognized the shape of that grief immediately, because I had lived inside the same one. And here is the strange part. We never once talked about the bid we had lost against each other. It stopped mattering somewhere along the way, though I could not have told you exactly when. My second rule was born out of the first one breaking. If I could not avoid her, I decided, I would at least keep things strictly professional. No personal calls, no lingering after meetings, no letting the conversation drift anywhere it did not need to go. I held that one for maybe 3 months, through 2 more joint projects and a dozen coffee runs that were absolutely not personal, according to the story I told myself. And then the warehouse project hit a snag that neither of us could solve alone. The old brick facade she wanted to preserve was carrying more load than the original architects had ever accounted for, and every solution I proposed either compromised her design or cost more than the client could afford. We stayed late one night, the 2 of us alone in the conference room with takeout containers between us and my father's pencil, scratching numbers onto tracing paper, while she sketched over my sketches with her own soft pencil, our lines overlapping until neither of us could say whose idea the final solution actually was. Somewhere around midnight, she looked up at me and said, "You know, for a man who claims to hate collaborating, you're not bad at it." And I laughed. Actually laughed, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit. That was the moment I understood that whatever this was becoming, it was not going to fit inside the rules I had built for myself. Here is the thing about self-imposed rules. You write them when you are protecting a wound, and you keep them long after the wound has started to heal, because the rule feels like proof that you learned something from the pain. My third rule, the one I never wrote down anywhere, but held on to tighter than the others, was that I would never bring work home with me again. Not in the way I had with Renee, not letting a professional relationship seep into the part of my life meant to be soft and undefended. But somewhere in that year, Mara stopped being a professional relationship. She became the person I texted when I saw an old brick building being demolished downtown, because I knew she would understand why it made my chest ache a little. She became the person I called after my father had a small health scare. Not because I needed advice, but because I wanted her voice on the other end of the line. I broke that rule slowly. The way you break something you cannot admit you are breaking. One small exception at a time, until one day I realized there was no rule left standing at all, just a woman I had spent 2 years calling my rival, who had somehow become the person I thought of first when anything in my life went sideways. There was a period, somewhere in the middle of that first year working alongside her, when I tried to talk myself out of what was happening by focusing harder on work than I had in years. I picked up extra projects. I stayed late doing reviews nobody had asked me to redo, telling myself it was diligence, telling myself a good engineer double-checks everything, when really I was just trying to fill the hours so I would not have time to notice how much I looked forward to seeing her name pop up on my calendar. It did not work the way I hoped. If anything, burying myself in extra work only made the quiet moments with her feel louder by comparison. The way a single clear note stands out more in a room that has otherwise gone silent. I would catch myself rereading her project notes twice, not because the second reading revealed anything new, but because something about the rhythm of her sentences felt like hearing her voice even when she was not in the room. Renee used to say I disappeared into my work when things got hard, that I would rather run 100 extra calculations than sit still with a feeling I did not know how to name. She was not wrong. It took me a long time after the divorce to understand that the habit was not really about the work at all. It was about control, about needing something in my life to behave exactly the way I expected it to when everything else felt unpredictable. Mara noticed that pattern in me faster than Renee ever had, maybe because she carried a version of the same habit herself. She told me once, over coffee on a Tuesday that started like every other Tuesday and ended up meaning more than I expected, that she used to redesign the same detail on a project 7 or 8 times, not because the first version was wrong, but because perfecting something small felt safer than sitting with the parts of her life that could not be perfected no matter how many times she tried. What changed everything, slowly, was realizing she never once used that knowledge against me. She could have. She had every opportunity, in a dozen meetings, to point out that I was overcorrecting a design because I was avoiding something bigger, and instead, she just kept showing up, steady, patient, letting me work through it in my own time. There is a particular kind of trust that grows out of watching someone choose not to exploit your weakest moments when they easily could have, and that trust built itself into something sturdier than any rule I had constructed to keep her at a distance. I remember the day the warehouse project finally got approved by the client. Both of our names on the final presentation, her design and my structural solution, woven together so completely that neither of us could take full credit for the finished plan. We celebrated with cheap coffee from a cart outside the client's office instead of anything fancier, standing on the sidewalk in the cold, and she raised her paper cup toward mine like we were toasting with champagne. "To the wall that almost broke us," she said, grinning, and I laughed harder than the joke deserved, because by then the wall we had almost lost the project over had become something closer to the wall that brought us together, a load-bearing problem we had solved side by side instead of against each other. Around that same time, my father's health scare happened. A fall in his garage that put him in the hospital for 2 nights, while doctors ran tests that ultimately came back clear. I called Mara before I called anyone else, not because I needed practical help, but because some instinct in me had already decided her voice was the one I wanted to hear in a moment of fear. She did not ask why I called her instead of a closer friend or a family member. She just stayed on the phone with me for over an hour while I sat in a hospital hallway under fluorescent lights, and near the end of the call she said something I still think about. "You don't have to carry things alone just because you're good at it, Daniel." I did not have an answer for that at the time. I do now. The metaphor I kept coming back to, the one I never said out loud to her, was about load paths, the way engineers think about how weight travels through a structure to find its way down to the ground. Every building has a load path, a route the forces take, and sometimes the path everyone assumes is obvious turns out to be wrong once you actually run the numbers. The wall you think is bearing the weight is not the wall doing the work. The column everyone overlooks is the one holding the whole thing up. I had assumed for 2 years that my resentment toward Mara Bishop was load-bearing, that it was structural to who I had become after my divorce, a necessary wall keeping the rest of me standing. What I slowly understood, watching her work, watching her care about the invisible math as much as the visible design, was that the resentment had never been load-bearing at all. It was decorative. It could come down without the rest of me collapsing. The real load path, the one actually holding me up, ran somewhere else entirely, and it had started running through her without my noticing. There was one more rule I had not admitted to breaking, even to myself, until much later. I had promised myself, quietly, back when the divorce first went through, that I would never again let a woman see the parts of my work that were unfinished. The rough drafts, the crossed-out numbers, the pages where I had clearly gotten something wrong before getting it right. Renee used to tease me, gently at first and then less gently near the end, about how careful I was to only show her the polished version of anything, as if a rough draft were a kind of nakedness I could not risk. I told myself after the divorce that the lesson was to guard that part of myself even more tightly, that unfinished work was a private thing, meant for me and the pencil and nobody else. Somewhere along the way, without ever deciding to, I had started leaving my rough drafts on the desk during meetings with Mara instead of tucking them away first. She never commented on it directly, but I noticed the way she would glance at the crossed-out numbers with the same care she gave the finished drawings, like the mistakes themselves were part of the work worth respecting rather than something to be hidden. By the time the regional retreat came around, the annual gathering the newly merged company held for both offices to meet each other properly, I was no longer pretending Mara Bishop was my rival. I had stopped pretending months earlier. Honestly, somewhere around the night she brought me soup after learning I had the flu and stayed to make sure I actually ate it, instead of just reheating it and forgetting. But I still had not said anything, because saying something meant admitting how far I had come from the man who stood in that parking garage 2 years ago blaming her for a bid I had lost fair and square. Saying something meant risking a version of failure that had nothing to do with calculations, and that terrified me more than any structural problem ever had. The retreat was held at a lodge outside Asheville, tucked into the mountains where the cell signal came and went depending on which way the wind blew, and everyone in both offices was required to attend for 3 days of team-building exercises that most of us privately dreaded. Room assignments were handled by HR, alphabetical by last name within each pairing group, and when the storm rolled in on the second night and half the staff who had planned to drive home early got stranded, the hotel ran short on rooms. Corwin and Bishop landed next to each other on the overflow list, and someone in HR, tired and rushing to solve a logistics problem before the power flickered again, paired us together without a second thought. I remember standing in the hallway with my bag in my hand, looking at the room number on the slip of paper, feeling something between panic and a relief I did not want to examine too closely. She took it better than I did, walking in ahead of me with her garment bag and her laptop case, already talking about the schedule for the next morning, like sharing a room with the man who used to resent her existence was the most natural thing in the world. And in a way, by then, it was. We had spent a year building something neither of us had named yet, coffee runs and late nights over tracing paper and a soup delivery that meant more than either of us said at the time. But a hotel room is different from a conference table. There was nowhere to hide behind an agenda, no project to point to as the reason we were in the same space. Just 2 people, a storm outside, and everything we had not yet said to each other filling up the room like weather of its own. I had brought a sketch with me, an early concept for a new project the firm was chasing. The kind of rough draft I never show anyone before it is ready. Drawn in pencil the way I always start everything, my father's pencil worn down to half its original length after all these years. I had left it on the desk while I went to find ice for the drink someone had smuggled past the retreat's alcohol policy, and when I came back, Mara was unpacking her bag on the bed nearest the outlet, and in the process of shifting her garment bag, she had knocked the sketch to the floor and folded it without noticing when she picked it back up. It was such a small thing, a folded corner on a piece of paper that meant nothing to anyone but me, and still, my whole body went tight when I saw it, because that sketch was not just a sketch, it was the part of myself I never let anyone see unfinished, the part I had spent 2 years protecting the way I protected everything else after Renee, quietly, alone. Behind a rule I had built so carefully, I forgot I was the one holding the door shut. "That is just paper, isn't it?" she said, watching my face change. "Why are you looking at it like I broke your arm?" And there it was. The moment I opened this story with, the one that felt like the highest point of everything that had happened between us, though I did not understand yet how much higher it was about to get before the night was through. I did not answer her right away. I picked up the sketch, smoothed the new crease flat against my knee, careful not to make it worse, and set it down on the desk like it still mattered, because it did, though not for the reason she assumed. I think she read something in my silence, because her expression shifted from amused to careful, the way people look at you when they realize a joke has landed somewhere they did not intend. "Daniel," she said, quieter now, "did I actually ruin something?" And I told her the truth, or most of it. I told her the pencil had been my father's, that I never showed anyone my rough drafts, that the fold did not matter in any way that mattered to the drawing itself, but that something about seeing it happen, in that room, with the storm outside and nowhere left to retreat to, had knocked something loose in me that I had been holding steady for 2 years. She sat down on the edge of her bed, still holding a folded sweater she had forgotten she was carrying, and she did not fill the silence the way most people do when a conversation gets uncomfortable. She let it sit. And then she said something I did not expect. "You know, I used to think you hated me because I beat your firm on that warehouse bid 2 years ago." I told her that was exactly what I used to think too, and admitting it out loud, in that room, felt like setting down something heavy I had been carrying so long. My arms had forgotten what it felt like to be empty. "I did not hate you," I said. "I think I needed someone to blame that year. And you were the easiest person to point at, because pointing at myself would have meant admitting I was already falling apart before you ever walked into a bid meeting." The rain kept coming, hard enough that the window rattled in its frame, and somewhere in the space between one sentence and the next, she reached over and picked up my father's pencil from where it sat on the desk beside the folded sketch. She turned it over in her hands, running her thumb along the worn brass band. "The way you handle something you understand is important without needing to be told why. This is the one you always sketch with," she said. Not a question, just an observation she had apparently noticed longer ago than I realized. I told her about my father, about the 30 years of surveying work that wore the brass green before it ever reached my hands, about the rule I had built that said a man draws his own lines before he lets a computer tell him what he is building. She listened the way she always listened, like the small details of a person's life were structural too, load-bearing in their own quiet way. And then she did something that changed the shape of everything. She picked up the sketch itself, the one she had folded without meaning to, and she looked at it properly for the first time, not as an accident she had caused, but as a piece of work she was actually seeing. Her eyes moved over my rough numbers, the load calculations scrawled in the margin the way I always worked out a problem before committing it to anything official, and she stopped at one line, tilted her head, and said, quietly, almost to herself, "Daniel, I think this number is off." She was right. I checked it twice before I believed her, and she was right both times. A small error in a sheer calculation that would not have mattered on paper but would have mattered in concrete, the kind of mistake that gets caught in review 9 times out of 10. But the 10th time it does not get caught is the time someone gets hurt. She did not say anything else about it. She did not gloat, did not turn it into a moment about her expertise crossing into my territory, the thing I had spent 2 years bracing myself against without ever admitting that was what I was bracing for. She just took my father's pencil, still in her hand from turning it over a moment before, and she circled the number lightly, so lightly the graphite barely marked the page, and wrote the corrected figure beside it, in her own small, careful handwriting. Then she handed the sketch back to me, pencil resting on top of the page, and said nothing at all. That was the moment I could not walk back from. Not the folded corner, not the conversation about our old rivalry, not even the confession about my father and the pencil and the rule I had built around it. It was watching her fix my mistake without making me feel small for having made it, using my own pencil, in my own handwriting style, like she had learned the shape of my work well enough to protect it instead of exploiting it. Renee never did that. Nobody in my life had ever done that, quietly correcting an error and handing it back without commentary, without needing credit, without turning my vulnerability into her leverage. I sat there holding that sketch with her correction circled in soft graphite, and I understood, the way you understand a load path once you have finally traced it all the way to the ground, that I was not looking at my rival anymore, had not been looking at her that way in a long time, and the only thing standing between us was a rule I had built to protect myself from a version of pain that she had never once tried to inflict. You could have just told me it was wrong, I said, my voice rougher than I meant it to sound. I know, she said. But I didn't want you to feel like I was scoring another point against you. I wanted you to feel like I was on your side of the table for once. And there it was, the barrier I had spent 2 years building around myself starting to come down, not because of some dramatic declaration, but because of a corrected number on a piece of folded paper, handed back to me by the one person who had somehow understood exactly what I needed without me having to explain it. We talked for another hour after that, the storm easing outside as the night wore on, and I told her things I had not said out loud to anyone since the divorce, about how I had let work become the only load-bearing part of my life because it was the only part that never left, about how I had built rule after rule to keep myself from ever depending on someone the way I had depended on Renee before it all came apart. And she told me about her own version of the same fear, about how she had thrown herself into her design work after her marriage ended, because a building, unlike a person, stays finished once you finish it, does not change its mind halfway through construction and decide it wants a different life. We were two people who had built our careers into fortresses, and somewhere in that hotel room, with the rain finally slowing to a drizzle against the glass, we both admitted the fortresses had gotten lonely. I did not kiss her that night, though I wanted to, and I think she knew I wanted to, because she smiled at me in a way that told me she was not in a hurry either. Some things, I have learned, do not need to happen the moment you realize you want them. Some things are better for waiting, the way a foundation needs time to cure before you can safely build on top of it. We talked until the drizzle stopped altogether, and then we slept in twin beds 3 feet apart, closer than we had ever been, and further than we both wanted to stay, and in the morning the sun came out over the mountains like the storm had never happened at all. The barrier did not disappear overnight, because barriers built out of real fear rarely do. I still carried the instinct to protect myself, to keep the soft parts of my life separate from the parts that could be measured and relied upon. But something had shifted permanently after that night, the way a structure shifts once you correct a foundational error, settling into a truer version of itself. Over the following weeks, back in the office, back in the rhythm of project meetings and coffee runs that were no longer pretending to be anything other than what they were, Mara and I stopped circling each other and started, slowly, deliberately, choosing each other instead. I told her, eventually, in the plainest words I had, that I did not think of her as my rival anymore, had not for a long time, and that the rule I built to protect myself from ever depending on someone again had quietly become the thing standing between me and the person I actually wanted to depend on. She told me she had known that for months, had been waiting for me to catch up to something she had already worked out on her own, patient the way she was patient with a client who needed time to see a design the way she already saw it. We faced the practical barrier honestly too, the fact that we worked for the same company, that a relationship between us would need to be handled carefully, transparently, without letting it compromise either of our work. We talked to our director together, laid it out plainly, agreed to recuse ourselves from directly reviewing each other's projects going forward. It was not dramatic. It was not a secret kept and then discovered. It was two adults handling something real the way you handle a structural problem, honestly, in the open, with a plan that actually held weight. Months later, on a quiet evening at my place, the same apartment I had lived in alone since the divorce, now slightly less alone in ways I was still getting used to, Mara found my father's pencil sitting in the cup on my desk where I kept my drafting tools. She picked it up the way she had that night in the hotel room, turning it over in her hands, and she asked me if I still used it for every sketch. I told her I did, that I always would, and I showed her the folded sketch from that night, still tucked into a drawer, the one with her small corrected number still circled faintly in graphite beside my own handwriting. She laughed, softly, and asked why I had kept something so small. I told her the truth. I told her that fold used to mean the moment something I protected got damaged without my permission. Now it meant the moment someone finally showed me what it looked like to be cared for without conditions, to have my mistakes corrected instead of exploited, to hand someone the unfinished, ugly, rough draft version of myself and have her hand it back gentler than she found it. The load path I had spent years assuming ran through my work, through the numbers that never argued with me, had actually run through her the whole time. Quietly, the way real weight always finds its way to the ground eventually, whether or not you drew the plans expecting it. She took the pencil from my hand that evening, sketched a small, rough line across the corner of a fresh sheet of paper, nothing important, just a habit she had picked up from watching me work for over a year, and she handed it back to me the way she always did, without needing credit, without making it about anything more than what it was. Outside, it was not storming. It was just an ordinary evening, quiet, unremarkable, the kind of evening that would have meant nothing to anyone else, but I understood, holding that pencil in a room that finally felt like it was carrying its weight the way it was meant to, that this was where everything between us had actually started. Not in some grand declaration, but in a folded piece of paper and a small correction offered without a single word of blame. Sometimes I think about the man I was in that parking garage 2 years earlier, certain that the woman who beat his firm on a bid was the reason his life had gone sideways. I wish I could tell him that the wall he was so busy blaming her for building was actually the one he had built himself, brick by brick, out of a grief that had nothing to do with her at all. I wish I could tell him that the load he was so afraid of carrying again would turn out to be lighter than he expected. Once he finally let someone else help him carry it, he would not have believed me. He was too busy holding everything up alone to imagine that the point of real strength was never about carrying weight by yourself in the first place. It was always about finding the right place to set it down.